G'day lads. I'm sure a majority of the class has played at least one Bioshock game. The series is a fantasy first-person shooter loosely based around all sorts of utopian societies. Myself, Scott, and Katie will be discussing the third installment of the series, Bioshock Infinite, under our Week 11 topic of fantasy. As a broad topic in games design, the fantasy genre involves fiction and uses magic or supernatural elements that are part of the main plot, theme, or setting. Often these games take place in imaginary worlds, and this is definitely the case for Bioshock Infinite, in which you play as Booker DeWitt, who is sent to a floating air city called Columbia. Already that we can see that a floating city is obviously fantasy. The reason you are sent to this floating city is to locate Elizabeth, who is held captive in Columbia. Once you rescue her, you start working together. Elizabeth is an AI-controlled player that follows you around and helps you fight enemies. She picks up ammo and health packs for you, which is rather handy. As you progress through the game, spoiler alert, you discover that Elizabeth has an unusual power to manipulate what the game calls tears, meaning that she can see alternate realities and alter what's happening. So now that we know the history of Bioshock and how it relates to the fantasy genre, we will move on to our first question. How does the game set up a world and tell a story? There is many different ways that the developers and story writers set up the game and continue to tell a story as you travel through the game world. There is a few main ways that this is achieved, and then numerous smaller things that the developers apply to add to the storytelling. Setting up a game world and story is often very difficult, as developers need to get very creative and original to make the beginning of the game interesting, while at the same time the player most likely doesn't know any of the controls or what's happening. So it needs to be interesting, but at the same time the player needs to learn the mechanics and controls of the game, and again, like I just said, nobody wants to play a boring tutorial. The creators of Bioshock did this very well. At the start of the game, you are late to the scene, waking up in a strange location with two other characters in front of you in a rowboat who are talking to each other. These characters have voice actors that most definitely suit their personalities, and you're not sure what they're talking about. They have this odd back and forth banter with each other, talking about you but never directly to you. It's rather odd and mysterious. It really makes the player ask themselves questions. Are they good? Are they enemies? Just who are these people? As key information is withheld from the player at the start. You don't even know who you're playing as or your name until around a minute into the game. This method of developing a starting sequence for a game is known as the party rule. The player is late to the scene and early to leave. There is no boring and onerous tutorial. The player is thrown straight into the deep end and has to gather information. No unfun stuff at the start. You are still given information, but it is not directly told to you. For example, the game doesn't tell you you are playing as Booker DeWitt directly. You are given an item and you have to put two and two together to work it out. The reason this sets up the world so well is because the information isn't handed to the player on a plate. It makes the player think, makes them ask a lot of what-if questions about the game and the plot. It adds to the immersiveness of the game. If the game is set up well, it is much easier to carry it on and tell a good story throughout the game and to keep the player interested. It makes the player want more, instead of having a boring tutorial part at the beginning and trying to draw them in later on. Immersion keeps the player interested and in the story and makes the player much more receptive to what you want them to feel. Personally, playing Bioshock Infinite, I would agree that the designers did a good job of making it immersive and in turn using this to tell the story. They achieved this immersion through the environment, the characters, and the plot. The world itself has a lot to explore. If you step away from the story and start looking around the world, you will talk to many interesting characters and find things in the environment that link other things together. For example, if you explore carefully, you will find the different audio recordings that give a backstory to the game. These backstories add more value to the characters, allow you to sympathize and empathize with their actions, and really allows you to connect with the game, rather than watching the game. It makes you feel more of a part of it. Using the plot to create immersion is very important too. We've all said it and heard people say this before. Yeah, that game was alright, but it's the same story that we've seen before. You need an original story to get most from your game. Having a good plot links with having relatable and interesting characters, but also with character goals. The player's goals, for example, at the start of the game is to rescue Elizabeth, but this expands and goals change or progress as the game continues. There's also many small goals that build up to a larger goal. A lot of plot is also told through conflict and combat. One of the secondary plot points of Infinite that we haven't really touched on too much is the battle between the Vox Populi and the White Americans, which represents upper class versus lower class. This conflict adds more tension to the game and pushes the game forwards. I will now pass over to Katie.
Players have choices presented to them to suit various playstyles. However, whilst this choice of style affects the player's experience playing the game, it does not directly impact the story of the game. The choices in-game which allow for this variation in playstyles includes the choices of weapons and vigors, as well as weapon upgrades and special gear. The choices of which weapons and vigors to use can greatly alter the experience of play when compared to other combinations. For example, the player may have a super aggressive playstyle. He or she may decide to go in guns blazing with a shotgun and a fire vigor, or stand back using a sniper rifle, slowly killing enemies, taking less damage, and using possession, the vigor which can be used on enemy machines to make them friendly. Weapon choices change the way the player interacts with the levels and how they approach conflict. These choices change the player's perspective on how they feel they want Booker to act, thus changing the way they perceive their own character in-game. Is their character's personality rash, rushing in for close-up combat, or is he more tactical, picking off enemies one at a time from a distance, carefully planning? While this does not directly impact the story, it can affect how they perceive Booker's personality. The player is also given the option to wear different clothing or gear, which do not visually change Booker's outfit, but offer unique enhancements, which will affect the player during combat. For example, the player can choose to wear the shock jacket, which will give a 50% chance to shock nearby enemies when the player is struck. While limited, the variation in players' choice of combinations of gear, weapons, and vigors can heavily impact the way in which the player experiences combat. Again, these choices have no impact on the plot of the game, only the player's playstyle and resulting experiences, particularly with combat. The game provides the player with a few in-game decisions to make, which may test the moral intentions of the player and force them to think carefully about what kind of character they want to act as. Such a choice is presented early in the game, where the player is given a baseball with which they can choose to throw at either the racist fair announcer or a seemingly innocent interracial couple who have been captured and displayed for ridicule. Here the player will consider whether to do the right thing, which would be to avoid throwing the ball at the couple. They can choose to be the good guy, or follow along with the racist community of Colombia and throw it at the couple. This choice early on can help shape the player's idea of what kind of character they want to portray through Booker. However, regardless of which option the player chooses, each option will result in exactly the same immediate outcome. The only possible difference presented to the player is an interaction with the couple later on in the game if the player should choose to throw at the announcer. Either way, the player is oblivious to the fact that this choice will not result in differing consequences. Every in-game choice such as this has no real impact on the game's plot. They do not affect the progression of the story, nor do they result in varying outcomes. These choices are presented to the player to give them the feeling that their personal choices are important and make them consider the path they choose. Players will have no way of knowing the impact of these choices unless they play the game again, making the opposite choices, only to realize that they will result in virtually identical outcomes. Bioshock Infinite has faced a lot of criticism for this reason, many arguing that Infinite acts as more of an interactive movie than a game, due to its linear narrative and highly limited player agency. The game progresses in a linear fashion. The player must follow a set path with limited opportunity to change their direction through exploration. The player can choose to visit buildings and rooms that are not necessary for progression. Such exploration offers some development to the story in the form of voxophones, voice recordings of characters in the game, which provide the player with information on these characters and gives them a deeper understanding of the game's plot. But as for the progression of the story, the player's choices have virtually no impact on how the plot develops.